Diane Stevens, once the picture of a perfect wife and mother, found herself tangled in a web of lies and betrayal that would destroy everything she held dear. Michael Stevens, the successful and unsuspecting husband, never imagined the woman he loved could be hiding a dark secret, one that would unravel their entire life. And then there was Alex, the young lover who seduced Diane with promises of passion and freedom, but whose true intentions would lead them all down a path of tragedy. What started as a forbidden affair soon spiraled into a dangerous conspiracy, one that would have devastating consequences for everyone involved. It seemed like the ideal life. A beautiful home tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a successful husband who was well respected in the community, and a seemingly perfect family. Diane and Michael Stevens were the kind of couple people admired. Diane, a former beauty queen in her early 30s, still had the looks that turned heads, though she'd traded in her modeling career for a life of domestic bliss. Michael, in his 40s, was a businessman who had worked his way up from humble beginnings. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, were the picture of innocence, always well-behaved and loved by their peers. On the outside, their life appeared to be something most people would envy. But beneath the surface, Diane was restless. The bustling life of family gatherings, PTA meetings, and charity events no longer filled the void she'd felt growing in her. Her marriage to Michael, once passionate, had become more of a routine, and their intimacy had faded into a distant memory. Michael's long hours at work meant he was rarely home, and when he was often too tired to notice how Diane had begun to change. The loneliness crept in slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but it grew stronger over time. Diane wasn't sure when it started, but she began to yearn for something more, a connection she hadn't felt in years. It was during this period of isolation that Diane met Alex. He was 25, a young and charismatic man with a confident smile and an energy that seemed to fill the room whenever he entered. He wasn't someone Diane would have normally noticed, young, vibrant, and yet somewhat reckless in his carefree attitude toward life, but there was something magnetic about him. They met at a local coffee shop, a chance encounter that would change everything. Diane was there, sitting alone with her latte, when Alex sat down at the table next to hers. He struck up a casual conversation, and what began as a polite exchange turned into a more personal one. Alex was kind and interested in her, not just as a woman but as a person. It was the first time in a long while that Diane felt seen and appreciated. As the days passed, their encounters became more frequent. At first, it was nothing more than a friendly chat whenever Diane stopped by the coffee shop. But soon, they were meeting outside of the cafe, taking walks through the park and talking for hours. Diane found herself confiding in Alex about her marriage, her dissatisfaction, and the emotional distance that had grown between her and Michael. Alex listened patiently, offering her the kind of attention and validation she had long been missing. He wasn't judgmental or dismissive, he simply listened, as though every word she said mattered. Diane felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Though she knew it was wrong, Diane couldn't deny the attraction she felt toward Alex. It wasn't just physical. There was an emotional spark between them that had been absent from her marriage for too long. Diane told herself it was harmless at first, a fleeting crush, nothing more. But as time went on, that spark ignited into something far more intense. She found herself looking forward to their meetings, craving the excitement Alex brought into her life. The thrill of their secret connection filled a gap that Diane hadn't even realized was there, and slowly, her world began to shift. What Diane didn't know was that Alex was just as captivated by her, though for reasons that weren't purely romantic. He saw in Diane an opportunity, a way to break free from the life he had been stuck in. He wasn't interested in her wealth or her family, but rather in the status and connections she could provide. He knew he had to keep her hooked, So he played the part of the attentive lover, saying all the right things, making her feel special. Neither of them knew yet that their innocent flirtation would spiral into something far darker, setting the stage for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. What began as a harmless flirtation between Diane and Alex quickly evolved into a dangerous liaison. Their secret meetings became more frequent, and the thrill of their stolen moments began to consume Diane. She would sneak out while Michael was at work, feeling the rush of excitement as she met Alex in hidden spots around town, sometimes in parks, other times at his apartment, away from prying eyes. The affair became their shared escape from the mundane routines of their everyday lives, a world where they could momentarily forget the consequences of their actions. At first, it was nothing more than an emotional connection, but as the days went on, their chemistry grew undeniable. Diane found herself drawn to Alex in ways she had longed for, and in return, Alex saw Diane as a way to break free from his own limitations. Diane was everything he wanted: mature, experienced, and someone who could offer him a glimpse into a world of comfort and security. He wasn't in love with her, not in the way she believed, but he wasn't about to let go of the opportunity she presented. Diane, for her part, was caught in the allure of Alex's attention. Michael's absence and disinterest only fueled her attraction to the young man. When she was with Alex, she felt alive, like she was reclaiming something she thought she'd lost, a sense of passion and desire. For weeks, she tried to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal, that she was merely enjoying the company of someone who made her feel special. But the deeper she sank into the affair, the harder it became to keep it hidden. Their encounters became more intense, crossing boundaries that Diane had never imagined herself crossing. The lines between right and wrong blurred as Alex pushed for more. He began asking for things beyond just affection. At first it was small. He wanted her to buy him things, a new jacket, a fancy dinner. But soon his demands became more urgent. Alex wasn't interested in a casual fling. He wanted more: money, power, and influence. And he knew Diane was in a position to provide those things. Diane was hesitant at first. She didn't want to hurt Michael, but Alex's persistence wore her down. It wasn't just about passion anymore. It was about control. He wasn't subtle in his requests. He pushed her further into a corner, making her feel guilty for not doing more for him. Diane became afraid of losing him, afraid that Alex would grow tired of her and move on to someone else. The more she tried to please him, the more he took. It wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a manipulation. The pressure of living this double life began to wear on Diane. She couldn't keep up with the lies. Every time she saw Michael, she had to pretend everything was fine, putting on a mask of the loving wife while secretly texting Alex, planning their next meeting. Her marriage was falling apart, but she couldn't bring herself to confront the reality of it. Instead, she buried herself deeper into the affair, telling herself that she deserved this, that she was entitled to a little happiness, even if it meant betraying her family. What Diane failed to see was the danger that lurked just beneath the surface of her relationship with Alex. The more she gave, the more Alex took. He wasn't a man in love. He was a man playing a game, using Diane to climb the social ladder, to gain access to the world of wealth and opportunity she could provide. The affair was no longer just about sex or emotion. It had become a calculated scheme, one that Alex was using to his advantage. And as the months went by, Diane found herself trapped in a web of lies, unable to escape the grip of her young lover's increasing demands. In the beginning it had seemed so simple, a brief escape from the monotony of her marriage. Now it was a tangled mess, and there was no way out without facing the consequences of her actions. Yet Diane kept telling herself that she could manage it all, that she could balance her life as the perfect wife at home with her secret, thrilling affair. But as her connection with Alex deepened, She began to wonder just how much longer she could keep up the facade before it all came crashing down. Diane's carefully constructed world began to crumble the moment Michael started to notice the subtle changes in her behavior. At first, he couldn't put his finger on what was wrong. She was still the same woman, still the same wife and mother she had always been. But there was something off. He noticed that she was spending more time on her phone, her attention distracted during family dinners, her laughter less genuine. The distance between them, which had been growing for years, now felt more pronounced. It was as though she was somewhere else, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. Michael didn't want to admit it to himself, but he started to wonder if there was someone else. At night, when Diane was alone, she could feel the pressure mounting. She had done her best to keep up the pretense of a happy marriage, but the lies she told were starting to eat away at her. Her guilt grew heavier with each passing day, and the fear of getting caught began to consume her. She had never meant for things to get so out of hand, but now it seemed there was no turning back. The affair with Alex had become more than just an escape. It had become a dangerous addiction. She was losing control over her own life, and the consequences of her actions were beginning to feel unavoidable. Michael, meanwhile, wasn't blind. He had begun to put pieces together, and what he found was unsettling. He wasn't a fool. He could sense the subtle changes. Diane's late nights, her increasingly distant attitude, the way she would quickly shut off her phone when he entered a room. There were too many little signs pointing in the same direction. One night, after Diane had left the house on one of her errands, Michael decided to follow her. He didn't know where she was going or what he expected to find, but something inside him told him he needed to know the truth. Michael trailed her from a distance, keeping his car far enough behind to avoid detection. It was a nerve-wracking experience. He told himself that he was overreacting, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. But as he followed her through the winding streets, something in his gut told him this wasn't just a simple errand. Diane stopped at a secluded spot near the outskirts of town, and Michael watched as she parked her car and walked into an apartment building. His heart dropped. He knew exactly what this was, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. Michael didn't confront Diane immediately. He wanted to give her the chance to come clean on her own. But that evening, when they were alone in their living room, the tension between them was palpable. Michael had seen enough. He asked her directly, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. Diane tried to deny it at first, but the lies began to fall apart. She was caught in her web, and there was no way out. It was then that Diane realized the full extent of her mistakes. The secret she had kept hidden for so long, the relationship she had so carefully protected, was now exposed. Michael didn't yell or demand answers. Instead, he was calm, eerily calm, as though he had already accepted the truth before she could say a word. Diane could feel his disappointment in every silent second that passed between them. She had never wanted to hurt him, but the damage was done. Michael wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, a way to fix the mess she had created. But no matter how hard she tried to justify her actions, she couldn't escape the fact that she had betrayed him. This wasn't just an affair. It was the breakdown of everything they had built together. In her desperation, Diane began to consider the impossible. How could she salvage her marriage without giving up Alex? She couldn't bear the thought of losing both her husband and her lover. And so, she began to plot, to devise a plan that would allow her to keep everything, her marriage, her family, and Alex, without having to face the consequences. It wasn't long before Diane realized that there was only one way out. She had to take control of the situation, manipulate it to her advantage. She would create a story, a narrative, where Michael was the one at fault, not her. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like a brilliant plan. She could blame Michael for the breakdown of their marriage, paint him as the unfaithful partner. It would be a risky move. But the idea of keeping Alex in her life, of not losing everything, became too tempting to resist. With her plan in mind, Diane knew she needed to act quickly. The clock was ticking, and the walls were closing in around her. But what she didn't realize was that her attempt to control the narrative would only pull her deeper into a dark spiral. The lies she had woven had already begun to unravel, and soon everything she had fought to protect would be on the verge of collapse. The tension in Diane's life had reached a breaking point. The affair with Alex had now become more than just a fling. It was a full-blown obsession. Diane knew her marriage was in tatters, but she still couldn't bring herself to end things with Alex. Michael had confronted her, and although he had demanded answers, the real devastation had been the disappointment in his eyes, something far worse than the anger. Diane had never felt so alone, and in her desperation to hold on to everything, she concocted a plan that would, in her mind, allow her to escape the crushing guilt and loss she feared. She began to meet Alex more frequently, not just for stolen moments of passion, but for discussions on how they could both break free from the mess she had created. Diane became fixated on the idea of turning the tables on Michael, of making him the villain in this twisted story. If she could paint him as the unfaithful one, the one who had ruined their marriage, she could justify everything. She would continue the affair with Alex while holding on to the remnants of her life with Michael. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that it was the only way forward. But there was one problem. Alex wasn't satisfied with being just her lover. Alex began making demands that were more alarming than Diane had anticipated. He wasn't just seeking affection and validation anymore. He wanted control. The more he learned about Diane's life, her family, her wealth, her connections, the more he realized that this affair could be his ticket to something greater. His requests became bolder, and the sense of danger grew. Diane had hoped to keep things under control, but Alex's ambition was insatiable, and she couldn't ignore the darkness in his desires. Alex made it clear that he wanted Diane to leave her husband and marry him. It wasn't enough for him to be her lover. He wanted her to choose him fully. Diane, already emotionally drained and caught in the web of lies, hesitated. She couldn't lose everything. But Alex had a way of pushing her past her limits. He played on her fears, telling her that if she didn't take decisive action, she would lose him forever. The ultimatum was set. Either she left Michael and fully committed to their future, or Alex would walk away. Diane knew she couldn't lose him. She was too far gone. And yet the thought of ending her marriage, of leaving her children behind, sent waves of panic through her. As if things weren't complicated enough, Alex's demands started to get darker. He wanted more than just her love. He wanted money and influence. Diane had always kept her finances separate from Michael's, but Alex pushed her to tap into her savings, to buy him things, to fund his lifestyle. At first, Diane resisted, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of using her wealth to satisfy his growing appetite. But Alex was persuasive, using their emotional connection to twist her sense of obligation. Soon he was asking for larger sums, money for investments, extravagant gifts, and even his debts paid off. Diane, now fully entrenched in the affair, gave in. She didn't want to lose Alex, and she didn't want to face the truth of her life without him. The further she went down this path, the harder it became to see the clear lines between right and wrong. But Alex's demands didn't stop there. The idea of leaving Michael for good, of starting a life with Alex, felt more like a dream than a reality. Diane, filled with fear and uncertainty, began to question how she could balance everything without losing control. The plan to frame Michael for an affair was already in motion, but now, Alex was pushing for something far more dangerous. He wanted her to do more, to manipulate her husband's finances, to make it look like Michael was the one having an affair. and to even plant evidence that would lead the authorities to believe Michael had committed a crime. The pressure was overwhelming. Diane found herself in over her head, trapped between the life she had built with Michael and the world Alex was pulling her into. The lies had become so intertwined that she couldn't separate them anymore, and Alex, ever the calculating figure, was pushing her further into a corner. He wasn't just her lover. He had become her partner in crime, and soon, there would be no escaping the consequences of their actions. Diane knew that things were spiraling out of control, but she couldn't find a way to stop it. The darker Alex became, the more she feared what he was capable of. The perfect life she had once had with Michael felt like a distant memory, and all she had left were lies, deceit, and a sense of impending doom that she couldn't shake. What had started as a secret affair had now turned into a dangerous game, one where the stakes were no longer just her marriage but her very freedom. She had reached the point of no return, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything forever. The consequences of Diane's decisions were finally catching up to her, and the tension that had been building for months erupted with devastating force. What was once a carefully orchestrated plan had become an uncontrollable, dangerous spiral. Diane had tried to juggle her family, her marriage, and her affair, believing she could manage it all. But in the end, the web of lies she had spun around herself and Alex collapsed, revealing the dark truth to everyone involved. It started with the night Michael came home earlier than usual. He had been suspicious for weeks, his mind racing with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night he discovered the missing piece of the puzzle. Diane had left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, and Michael, driven by both anger and desperation, scrolled through it. He found a series of texts from Alex, texts that not only confirmed the affair but also hinted at plans that were far darker than just infidelity. Diane's attempts to hide her relationship with Alex had failed. Michael had seen enough to know that his wife was no longer the woman he had married. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. But what came next was something he had never anticipated. As Michael pieced together more of the messages, he uncovered a troubling pattern: plans to manipulate their financial situation, false evidence planted to accuse him of infidelity, and even veiled threats that Alex had made, implying that he would expose more than just the affair if Diane didn't comply with his demands. What Diane had believed was a simple affair had become a complex scheme, one that Alex had been using to control her, to exploit her, and to manipulate her into abandoning everything she had known. It was too much for Michael to bear. But instead of confronting Diane right away, he did something that would change everything. He contacted the police. What Diane had failed to realize was that Alex, in his desperation, had begun to make mistakes, leaving behind traces of his involvement in their scheme. When the police arrived, armed with evidence, the reality of the situation became clearer than ever. Diane and Alex were no longer just part of a love triangle. They were involved in something far more sinister, and the investigation would unravel the truth in ways they had never expected. When Diane was confronted, her world shattered. She tried to deny everything, claiming that Alex had manipulated her, that she hadn't been fully aware of what he was planning. But the evidence against her was undeniable. The investigators uncovered financial records, messages between Diane and Alex, and even testimonies from people who had witnessed their increasingly reckless behavior. The once perfect wife, who had played the role of the doting mother and loyal partner, was now exposed as a master manipulator, willing to betray her family to keep her lover close. Alex, too, was arrested. The young man who had once charmed Diane with his boyish looks and promises of a better life was now seen for what he truly was: a calculating opportunist. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that his manipulation of Diane had been calculated from the start. He had used her to further his own goals, slowly convincing her to put everything on the line. What started as an affair had transformed into a full-blown conspiracy, with Alex using Diane as a pawn in a dangerous game. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Diane's once glamorous life, which had been built on appearances and charm, now crumbled under the weight of her lies. The woman who had seemed to have it all, success, beauty, and a perfect family, was revealed to be just another victim of her own choices, her own desperation. She was convicted of conspiracy and attempted fraud, her punishment a sobering reminder of how far she had fallen. As for Michael, the pain of betrayal stayed with him long after the trial. He was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered family, raising their children alone while trying to rebuild his life. The damage to his heart was deep, and trust would never come easily again. Alex, too, faced a lengthy prison sentence, but even as he was led away in handcuffs, there was no remorse in his eyes. He had gotten what he wanted. He had used Diane to climb higher, to escape his own struggles. But now, all that was left for him was the cold, harsh reality of the choices he had made. Diane, once the darling of her social circle, was now a cautionary tale. A woman whose desire for excitement, validation, and control led her down a path of destruction. In the end, the affair with Alex had cost her everything. The love of her children, the respect of her community, and the life she had once known. Her tragic story was one of manipulation, betrayal, and deceit, and as she sat in prison, she could only reflect on how far she had fallen, how the darkness she had embraced had led her to the ruin of everything she had ever cared about.